When we think of colonialism, we often picture flags, soldiers, railroads, and revolts. But there was another battlefield, quieter, more insidious, and far more enduring. It was a war of ideas, a battle not fought with guns or swords, but with assumptions, with worldviews, with stories about who we were and who we were allowed to be. British colonial rule in India wasn't just about land and taxes. It was about rewriting identity, redefining civilization. The British didn't simply want to govern. They wanted to convince India that she needed governing, that her ancient philosophies were outdated, her spirituality irrelevant, her people in need of saving. It wasn't just political domination. It was civilizational supremacy. But India responded, not only on the streets, but in the soul. Across decades, a quiet revolution began to unfold, one rooted not in violence, but in vision. Thinkers like Swami Vivekananda, Rabindranath Tagore, and Mahatma Gandhi began to speak, not merely to colonial power, but to its underlying assumptions. They didn't just argue for independence. They challenged the very foundation of colonial ideology. They reached into India's philosophical heart, into Vedanta, into the wisdom of non-duality, into the ethical pulse of Dharma and Ahimsa, and pulled forth a vision of the world that didn't depend on conquest to define strength or wealth to measure progress. Through them, Indian philosophy became more than a relic of the past. It became a weapon of awakening. Because resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it speaks softly, like a scripture remembered. Sometimes it doesn't overthrow power. It dissolves it by showing that power was never real to begin with. And that's where our story begins. Not with empire, but with a question. What happens when a civilization reclaims the right to define itself? To rule a land is one thing. To convince its people that they are unfit to rule themselves, that's something far more enduring. The British Empire did not simply conquer India with armies and treaties. It conquered with narratives. It told a story, again and again, that India was backward, irrational, bound by superstition and stagnant traditions, that it needed saving, that it needed the light of Western reason and civilization. This was the so-called civilizing mission, a claim that colonialism was not theft, but a gift. But behind that polished rhetoric was a quieter violence, not physical, but intellectual. What we now call epistemic violence, the act of dismissing, distorting, or erasing an entire worldview in order to replace it with another. India, with its deep philosophies and spiritual traditions, didn't fit neatly into the British idea of progress. So it had to be reframed, rewritten. Orientalist scholars began translating sacred Indian texts, but not to understand them, rather to control them. They lifted verses from the Vedas and the Gita, stripped them of nuance, and used them as proof of India's so-called decay. Even the wisdom of the Upanishads was recast as mysticism gone too far. Beautiful, perhaps, but childlike, lacking rigor, lacking modernity. And so, for generations, Indians were taught to look at their own heritage through foreign eyes. Eyes that saw only flaws. Eyes that judged difference as deficiency. That was the most dangerous lie, that to be Indian was to be less. But this distortion didn't go unchallenged. Slowly, voices began to rise. Not with rebellion, but with remembrance, with reclamation. Indian thinkers would soon begin not just to defend their traditions, but to reinterpret them, to renew them, and to shine through them a light far brighter than the empire ever imagined. And in that light came the first flickers of true resistance. Sometimes, the most radical act of rebellion is simply to remind someone of who they truly are. At a time when India was being told it was broken, primitive, and inferior, Swami Vivekananda stood up and said something profoundly simple. You are divine, not metaphorically, not aspirationally, but truly, essentially divine. He didn't carry weapons. He didn't lead armies. What he carried was Advaita Vedanta, the ancient Indian philosophy that teaches non-duality, that all of existence is one, that the self and the absolute are not separate, that beneath all distinctions of race, caste, and creed, there is only one eternal truth, manifesting in different forms. Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. In reviving Advaita, Vivekananda wasn't just promoting a spiritual idea, he was offering a philosophical antidote to colonial degradation. If every being is divine, then no empire has the right to rule another. If all life is one, then no race is superior to another. If truth resides within, then no outsider gets to define your worth. And then came 1893, the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago. In that now legendary speech, he didn't arrive as a humble student of the West. He arrived as a representative of one of the world's oldest, richest, and most profound traditions. He greeted the audience not with submission, but with brotherhood. Not with mimicry, but with dignity. He spoke of tolerance, not as concession, but as truth. Of universality, not as uniformity, but as oneness. He turned the colonial gaze back upon itself, not with hostility, but with wisdom. To the Western world, he introduced a Hinduism that was rational, ethical, inclusive. Not the exotic, chaotic caricature often peddled by colonial scholars, but a deeply thoughtful philosophy rooted in compassion, introspection, and cosmic unity. And to Indians, especially the youth, he offered something even more precious: self-respect. He told them their heritage was not something to be ashamed of, but something to be revered. That their poverty did not define them. That the real poverty was forgetting their own spiritual inheritance. Vivekananda didn't preach nationalism in the way we think of it today. He wasn't asking for flags or slogans. He asked for remembrance, for awakening. He believed that political freedom would follow naturally from inner transformation, that when people saw themselves as divine, they would no longer accept being ruled as subjects. He called for strength. Not the strength to dominate, but the strength to stand tall, to serve, to uplift. He believed service to humanity was service to the divine, because in every face, God was present. His Vedanta wasn't an escape from the world. It was a call to engage with it, consciously and courageously. And in doing so, he laid a foundation, a spiritual architecture upon which others could build. Because while Vivekananda spoke to the soul of the nation, others, like Rabindranath Tagore, would take that soul and translate it into music, poetry, and education, into culture itself. Not all resistance comes wrapped in slogans. Some arrives in the form of a poem, a melody, a classroom open to the sky. And sometimes, the fiercest revolution begins with a quiet refusal to conform, to imitate, to forget. Rabindranath Tagore was a philosopher-artist who didn't carry the fire of rebellion in his fists, but in his heart. He saw clearly what many around him missed, that both colonial domination and blind nationalism were symptoms of the same disease, forgetting who we are. Tagore was deeply critical of the British project of industrial modernity, not because he rejected technology or science, but because he saw what it was doing to the human spirit. It replaced beauty with efficiency, wisdom with information, and turned education into a machine that produced obedient workers rather than awakened souls. But he was equally cautious of Indian nationalism when it mimicked the West, adopting its aggressions, its boundaries, its need to define identity by exclusion. What he longed for was something deeper, a return to the Upanishadic vision of life, not as conflict, but as communion. A philosophy where freedom wasn't just political, but internal, where the soul was not chained by ideology, but open to the infinite. From the Upanishads, he drew the idea that truth is not owned. It is revealed again and again through love, inquiry, and inner silence. And so, he built Santiniketan, Not just a school, but a sanctuary, a place where children could learn under trees, where learning followed the rhythms of nature, where art, science, and philosophy coexisted without hierarchy. It was a living experiment in what Indian education could be, rooted in cultural memory, yet expansive in vision. Tagore believed education should not train the mind to serve power, but to question it, soften it, transcend it. His art, too, was a kind of resistance. His poems, songs, and plays did not shout. They invited. They whispered of a world where love dissolves fear, where the self does not end at the skin, and where the boundaries between East and West, colonizer and colonized, are illusions waiting to be unlearned. Tagore didn't fight empire with counter-empire. He fought it by stepping outside its frame. He reminded India that her greatness lay not in competing with the West, but in offering a different way of being, one rooted in unity, harmony, and inner freedom. He saw the danger in becoming what we resist. He urged us to be something else entirely. His humanism wasn't abstract. It was grounded in Indian thought, but it stretched beyond nation, beyond race. To him, the real struggle wasn't between India and Britain, but between the soul and the machine. And in every song he sang, in every lesson he shaped, he asked, "Can we create a world where the spirit is not sacrificed for progress?" While Tagore expressed this vision through culture and education, another giant would soon step forward, one who took these same philosophical roots and walked them into the streets. Gandhi, a man who made ethics a method and resistance a prayer. What do you do when the system you are up against doesn't just command armies, but shapes beliefs? When the chains are not only iron, but internal? When your freedom isn't only a matter of borders, but of being? For Mahatma Gandhi, the answer was simple, but not easy. You live the truth. You become the resistance. And you do it without raising a single weapon. Gandhi's revolution was unlike any the world had seen. He didn't seek to match violence with violence. He didn't want to outmuscle the empire. He wanted to out-moral it. And to do that, he reached into the depths of Indian philosophy, drawing on threads both ancient and profound. From Jainism, he inherited the principle of Ahimsa, non-violence, not merely as abstention from harm, but as a way of life, a posture of reverence toward all living beings. From the Bhagavad Gita, he drew the call to act without attachment to outcome, to serve with devotion, and to align one's actions with the divine law of Dharma. And from the Upanishads, he absorbed the idea that truth is not fixed or external, but revealed through inner inquiry and self-purification. All of this crystallized into a force he called Satyagraha, literally, truth force. It was not passive resistance, it was active love. It was a protest as prayer, a refusal to cooperate with injustice, not out of hatred, but from a deeper loyalty to what is right. Satyagraha didn't aim to defeat the British, it aimed to awaken them. Gandhi believed that true resistance was not about overpowering your enemy, but about transforming the relationship between you. He held up a mirror to the empire, and in doing so, revealed its moral emptiness. How could a government claim to be civilized while brutalizing a people who refused to fight back? How could it preach justice while denying it to millions? And yet, Gandhi didn't stop there. His concept of Swaraj, self-rule, was not just about throwing off colonial rule. It was about inner sovereignty, about each person becoming master of their desires, their fears, their ego. He knew that simply replacing British rulers with Indian ones would solve nothing if the consciousness remained colonized. Swaraj, to him, was an ethical state of being, a call for integrity, simplicity, and responsibility. He urged Indians not to wait for freedom to be given, but to live as if they were already free, to spin their own cloth, to speak their own languages, to walk their own path with dignity. His politics wasn't just about the nation, it was about the soul. And in that way, It transcended politics entirely. What made Gandhi so powerful was that he didn't offer revenge. He offered release, not just for the oppressed, but for the oppressor. Because he believed that everyone was bound, some by chains, others by illusion. And true liberation could never come from hatred. Only love could do that. Only truth. In Gandhi's hands, Indian philosophy became a living fire, warm, luminous, and impossible to ignore. His was not a war to conquer land, but to reclaim conscience. And in walking barefoot, fasting, praying, and disobeying unjust laws, he reminded the world of a forgotten truth: that moral authority is the only authority that lasts. And so, from Vivekananda's vision to Tagore's songs to Gandhi's walk to the sea, we've seen how individual minds and hearts lit the way forward. But these were not isolated lights. They were flames drawn from a deeper fire, a philosophical tradition that pulsed through India's collective soul. Let's turn now to that current, to the ideas themselves, and to how Indian thought, particularly non-duality, challenged the very foundations of colonial power. If colonialism operated through separation, dividing ruler from subject, civilized from savage, power from morality, then Indian philosophy answered with its most profound counterspell: Advaita. At the heart of Advaita, Vedanta is a truth so simple it sounds radical. There is no essential separation. Not between you and me, not between self and God, not between the seen and the unseen. All of reality is one, a single, undivided presence, known as Brahman, manifesting through countless forms. Now compare this with the world the British Empire built, a world carved by dualisms, white and brown, west and east, modern and primitive, ruler and ruled. These binaries weren't just social, they were psychological. They allowed the colonizer to justify domination, and the colonized to internalize inferiority. But Advaita didn't play by those rules. It said, none of this is ultimately real. The moment you identify someone as other, you have stepped away from truth. The essence within all beings is the same. The soul is not separate from the divine. The universe does not divide. It reflects. This was more than spiritual poetry. It was a philosophical weapon. Indian thinkers used it to dismantle the moral architecture of colonialism. If there is no essential difference between beings, then the idea that one race is destined to rule another collapses. If every soul is a mirror of the divine, then every act of injustice is not just political. It's a cosmic error. Advaita gave resistance a metaphysical foundation. It didn't merely argue for equality, it revealed it. And in doing so, it turned the colonial project upside down. Because how do you govern a people who believe they are not separate from truth itself? How do you dominate someone who sees the divine in all things, even in you? The Indian freedom movement wasn't only about reclaiming land. It was about reclaiming perception, about remembering a way of seeing that colonialism had tried to erase. And that's the power of Indian philosophy. It didn't just deconstruct domination. It offered a vision, a path, a possibility. It gave the world a glimpse of an ethics that wasn't built on fear, competition, or control, but on unity, sacredness, and interbeing. And from that vision, a deeper ethic emerged, one rooted in Dharma, Karma, and responsibility. Because in a world where everything is connected, every action matters, every choice ripples, and that's where we're headed next. In the face of empire, what guides you when the laws are unjust? What sustains you when the system says resistance is a crime? For many Indians during the freedom struggle, the answer wasn't found in Western ideologies. It came from within, from two ancient pillars of Indian thought: Dharma and Karma. Dharma is often translated as duty, but that barely scratches the surface. It's not obligation in the legal sense. It's alignment. It's the call to act in harmony with truth, with justice, with the deeper order of life. It asks not what is easy or even what is legal, but what is right. And right action, in the Dharmic view, is never selfish. It serves something greater. It protects the sacred web of life. Then comes karma, not as fate, but as ethical causality. Every action, every word, every choice leaves an imprint. It shapes not only your future, but the world around you. There's no cosmic scoreboard, just the simple truth that consequences follow consciousness. That intention matters, that nothing is ever lost. Together, Dharma and Karma offered something powerful to a colonized people. A moral compass that was both personal and collective. It told them they were not helpless, that even small acts, spinning cloth, refusing salt, speaking the truth, mattered. That each individual bore a sacred responsibility, not only to resist injustice, but to become the kind of person who couldn't live with it. This wasn't passive spirituality. It was radical ethical activism. It taught people that freedom wasn't a gift to be granted. It was a dharma to be fulfilled. That the path to liberation didn't begin in parliament. It began in the self. And from there, it radiated outward. This is why the Indian freedom movement was not just a political campaign. It was a moral awakening, a spiritual renaissance. Ordinary people, farmers, teachers, mothers, students, began to see their struggle not as rebellion, but as seva, sacred service, the work of the soul. And as these ideas took root, Indian philosophy began to reveal its true nature. It was never merely a defense against domination. It was a force of transformation, a vision for a different kind of world, one where freedom wasn't just freedom from, but freedom for. In the story the British Empire told itself, modernity was the prize. Railways, factories, bureaucracy, these were the signs of progress, the evidence of a superior civilization. But Indian thinkers looked at this glittering promise and asked a different question. At what cost? To them, the problem wasn't just colonization, it was the worldview behind it. A worldview that equated advancement with control. That measured success by extraction. That saw the earth as resource, not relationship. People as labor, not life. Gandhi called it modernity without soul. A kind of development that multiplies wants without satisfying needs, that builds machines but forgets the man. For him, the British model wasn't something India should chase. It was something India should liberate itself from. Because when power grows faster than wisdom, it inevitably collapses under its own weight. Tagore, too, warned of this danger. He saw the rise of mechanical education, standardized, uniform, sterile, and feared what it would do to the human spirit. A system that conditions minds to conform, not to awaken. He believed true learning should stir the soul, not just feed the system. Indian philosophy responded not by rejecting change, but by reimagining what true progress means. It proposed an alternative civilization, one not driven by endless growth, but by inner growth, where the measure of a society isn't what it conquers, but what it cultivates. Compassion, clarity, connection. This wasn't about nostalgia. It was about balance. A way of life where material well-being was not divorced from spiritual maturity. Where science walked hand in hand with silence. Where the future wasn't something to dominate, but something to serve. And in offering this vision, Indian thought stopped being reactive. It became creative. It stopped merely resisting the empire and began planting seeds for something far more enduring. What unfolded in India during the struggle for independence wasn't just a political upheaval, it was a spiritual reawakening, a remembering. Indian philosophy, once dismissed as mystical and outdated, became the very ground upon which a new nation stood. But it wasn't simply revived, it was modernized, reinterpreted for a world in flux. Thinkers like Vivekananda, Tagore, and Gandhi didn't cling to the past. They carried it forward, bridging ancient wisdom with urgent contemporary needs. In doing so, they reshaped resistance. It wasn't just about ending British rule. It was about redefining what freedom meant, not just as escape from oppression, but as an inner liberation, a reclamation of dignity, direction, and depth. These ideas didn't fade with the lowering of the Union Jack. They flowed into the very fabric of independent India. The Constitution, though influenced by Western democratic ideals, carried the pulse of Indian thought. Its emphasis on pluralism, on the dignity of all beings, on justice not as punishment, but as balance. And beyond India's borders, the ripple continued. Gandhi's principles inspired movements from the American civil rights struggle to South Africa's fight against apartheid. The ideas of nonviolence, ethical responsibility, and inner transformation continue to echo in movements for peace, ecological harmony, and global justice. Because the questions Indian philosophy wrestled with, what is the self? What is freedom? What is right action? Aren't bound by geography or era. They belong to all of us, and they still whisper to those who listen. In the end, philosophy wasn't the backdrop to India's freedom. It was the soul of it. A soul that remembered its worth, reclaimed its voice, and radiated its truth. Not in conquest, but in consciousness.